the last and final prophet of Allah. He was a mercy unto the universe. Peace and blessings be on Al-Mustafa. So he began this perfect man.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to the Hadith Principles. We're learning about the Hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Their importance to us for understanding our religion and practicing it, and the great scholarly efforts to develop the principles by which we can distinguish that which is correctly attributed to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, from that which may be falsely attributed to him, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. I would like to introduce our panel here who join us every day. Welcome, brothers. Brother Hussam, introduce yourselves, inshallah.
My name is Hussam Al-Din Alam from Egypt.
My name is Ayman, I'm from North Carolina.
Okay.
Muhammad Mamdouh from Virginia in the United States.
Inshallah, welcome, brothers. I hope this is useful for you guys, and inshallah we're all getting benefit. And it's a pleasure to be with you here and studying the principles by which we analyze the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. We're talking about the different grades of hadith, and we're looking at a lot of different examples of hadiths that are sahih, authentic, hasan, good hadiths, and the da'if hadiths, those hadiths which are too weak and cannot be used as a source for Islamic teaching of what we should do or believe as Muslims, unless there is some other evidence beside that hadith that would lead you to a conclusion. And so we're examining some of the hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing upon him, or things that are attributed to him, which may or may not be authentic. And the hadith about urinating in running water. In our last episode, we started talking about that is forbidden to urinate in running water. But it is actually weak. And since in its isnad, number one, there's somebody unknown, majhul. When they're unknown, you don't know whether they're authentic or not. And so you have to know. Not everybody's qualified to narrate a hadith. And so it's assumed, in fact, most people are not qualified to narrate hadiths unless they're sahabi. And so when we don't know who the person is, we can't accept the hadith unless there's another chain somewhere else that will support that meaning. It also contains someone who's accused of lying, and it is an'ana. That is, it says an, in the authority of, rather than saying, I heard, or I heard the Prophet say, or something like that, and it is by Abu Zubair, who is a mudallis. And so if somebody has been known to practice tadlis, which means they sometimes hide the true identity of the person from whom they learned the hadith, then we have to have that person specify that he actually heard that hadith from that person. And since he's known that in the past he has practiced tadlis, and he's saying an in Arabic, that does not indicate that he heard it directly from his teacher. And it is further contradicted by the hadith of Al-Layth that is reported by Muslim from the Prophet, that the Prophet ﷺ forbade us from al-bol bil-ma' fil-ma' al-da'im alladhi la yajri, the water which is stagnant, which does not run. And it's obvious in Islam that we don't urinate in water and pollute water. Still water cannot be used for purification. It has to be running water. People used to, for example, the world was wide, nature was great, people were few, and they used to think that, whatever goes into the water, it dissolves and it disappears. But as populations grow and there's a strain on our resources, in Islam, our principle is basically, if an individual did it, it would be inconvenient for that individual. When it is multiplied on the level of the whole society, then it becomes an emergency matter, a durura matter. And so if one individual urinates in water, that's not going to affect it. But when the sewage of a whole society is dumped in the water, even though the water is flowing, it doesn't get pure, it doesn't dissolve, and so pollution of any water is not allowed in Islam. It's not allowed to pollute the ocean or the lakes or streams or anything. Some kinds of pollution, there's no way of preventing them. But in Islam, we have to prevent polluting the sources of water because sources of water are a necessity for everyone. It's an emergency necessity to preserve water for purification and drinking and human life, as well as the creatures of the oceans, the fish, and other creatures. And so it's not allowed in Islam to pollute the water, even if it's the ocean. But, of course, the hadith is specific about the still water, because in Arabia, there was very little running water. The water was still, and so if a person came ignorantly and polluted that water, it would be polluted. And if in Islam, if the taste or smell or color characteristics of the water changes, then it's not permissible to use it for purification. And so it is not allowed in Islam to pollute the water. But the hadith about urinating in running water is considered da'if, and it's because of tadlis, the principle that we discovered, because the scholar, the hadith narrator, did not say specifically that he heard that hadith directly from his teacher, and he's known to hide some teachers who were weak and were not strong. Another hadith that you may have heard of, and the dyeing of the beard with black, sawad, dyeing your beard black.
Forbidden?
And so it's narrated, and this is found in Fiqh al-Sunnah, Sayyid Sabiq. Sayyid Sabiq, a very respectful scholar. A group of them, meaning the Sahaba, used to use black dye. They used to dye their beards black. But Sheikh al-Albani says, even if that is established, it is not proof, since it contradicts a saying and action of the Prophet ﷺ. So if something contradicts an established hadith of the Prophet, then what is it considered?
Shuzuz.
Yes,
Yeah, shad.
it's shad. Contradicts the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And what is reported from the leading companions, such as Abu Bakr and Ammar, radiyallahu anhuma, that they died with henna and kattan. So they died with natural red or yellow dyes, not black dye. So the difference is that black dye, you're trying to
Mislead others.
You're trying to make it deceive people and not let them see that you have gray hair, while the yellow and red dye show that you're actually dyeing your hair. It's not a deceit, and there's not a trick involved in it. And so it's in Islam, since that's what the Prophet did and what the companions did, that is what normally we would consider the sunnah, or the recommended practice, not something that contradicted what they did. And so when you see the Prophet did something and Abu Bakr did it and Umar did it, you wouldn't normally think that it would be the sunnah to disregard what they had did, especially when there's a doubt whether any of the Sahaba did that. Ibn al-Qayyim said that there's a doubt that it's not firmly established on any of the companions that they died with black. And so An-Nawawi states that it is forbidden in Majmu', which is a very large book. It was incomplete Nawawi did not complete Majmu'. So it was, yes, Jazakallah. But he states clearly, Imam Nawawi says, using the hadith of Jabir, that it is forbidden. And even if it is established from a source, such as Ibn Hajar mentions in Fath al-Bari, commentary on Sahih Bukhari, a saying of a Zuhri. So Zuhri is Tabi'i. He's the second generation. So it's a saying of Zuhri. You can't contradict the saying of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ with the saying of Zuhri. And you can't contradict even the saying of the Khulafa Rashidin, the righteous Khalifas, like Abu Bakr and Umar, by a Zuhri. So if a Zuhri said something, then it's maqtu'. Right? It's maqtu' because he is the second generation. If the Sahaba said it, then it's mawquf. And so the basic rule is for the Muslim Ummah that when the Prophet ﷺ said something and the companions did it, other statements are weak. They do not contradict that, and so it is da'if. And so it's basically clear in Islam that using black dye is forbidden. And without doubt, Ibn Qayyim said, this is correct without doubt, that it is forbidden to use black dye. And so there's another hadith. The best of that which you use as a dye is black. It makes you more desirable to your women and puts fear of you into the hearts of your enemies, reported by Ibn Majah. But it is weak in its isnad. It contains 2 weak narrators, and so it could not contradict the sahih in any case. And so there is in the fiqh, some scholars say, for the war, that it's permissible to dye your hair black for the war to deceive the enemy, because as the Prophet said, the war is khuda, it's deceit. And so Allah knows best. That is the fiqh or ijtihad of some scholars. That's their opinion, but that is not proven in any authentic hadith. And so the da'if hadith is the hadith that contains discrepancies, either in the isnad itself, lack of continuity, or tadlis, where the true nature of the chain has been distorted, intentionally or unintentionally, or there's somebody who has been known to lie, or who's questionable in their character, or who has made many, many mistakes, or their narration opposes other narrations in more reliable sources, or they're involved in bid'ah, or there's a doubt about that person, and there is no other narration that will back that up. If it has a few defects, it's considered maybe slightly weak. If it has many defects, then it'll be da'if jiddan, very, very weak, very close to mawdu' or fabricated. We're going to go for a break, and we'll be back shortly. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah.
Ask Hoda.
If you're still in Mecca or close by to Mecca, then you have to know that you are still in the state of ihram. As long as it is not for sale, then he does not have to pay zakah for it. Forbade praying witr similar to Maghrib prayer. So whoever prays witr 3 rak'ahs and sitting after the second rak'ah as if he's praying Maghrib prayer, this is forbidden, this is haram. Euthanasia is permissible with animals but not with human beings. If an animal is suffering, killing an animal for a legitimate reason is permissible. Both are acceptable, but the majority say that after the ruku' is the place of qunut. But both was reported.
Have a question or concern on your mind? Hoda TV decided, based on popular demand, we will be bringing you an additional episode of Ask Hoda with Sheikh Asim bin Luqman Al-Hakim live from Jeddah, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back from our break. Welcome back to Hadith Principles. We're discussing the Hadith da'if, the weak hadiths. And they are the hadith that do not meet the criterion for a hasan or sahih hadith because there are breaks in the chain or doubts about those chains or doubts about the narrators in the chain, their character, whether they were truthful or not, or whether one of them was hidden by tadlis, and so it was actually taken by somebody who is doubtful, and even it was put in the name, perhaps, of somebody else, or the character of those people has been impugned. Now, there are different levels of da'if. And so if we said a da'if is basically a D, well, there are also da'if jiddan, a D minus hadith. That is when there are many, many causes that any one of them would make it a da'if hadith, yet there are many causes. So you'll find a break. In one hadith, you'll find a break here. You'll find a tadlis there. And you'll find a liar or a person who is very forgetful or made many mistakes. And so you'll find people who are of bid'ah, people who were involved in heresies and were known to fabricate hadiths and lie. And so that would be da'if jiddan, very weak, So that's your basic D minus hadith. And then, of course, below that are the total fabrications of hadith. And so we just gave a few examples. There are many others in Islam that we will study, in fact, more in this program, more of the hadith, inshallah, in future episodes. Inshallah. Any questions,
yes,
brother?
sir, please. At the beginning of this episode, you said that hadith da'if may be incorporated by another evidence. It may be a hadith hasan لغيره.
Yes.
Is it only to be for it to transfer from a da'if to a hasan لغيره? Is it only to be provided by or packed up by another hadith only, or it may be packed up by reason or logic?
Oh, mashallah. This is very important. Okay, what the question is about are, first of all, the hadith, as we said, they are da'if and da'if jiddan. These hadiths really are not likely to be of any benefit, no matter how many of them you had, especially if they have shulud, they're shad, they're contradictory to more authentic sources. But the da'if hadith that have some weakness, when you find other hadiths, maybe they also have weaknesses, but they back each other up, you put them together. And so that becomes what? What's that called?
Hasan لغيره.
Hasan li ghayri. And so it goes from being a D hadith to a C hadith, inshallah. It can be acceptable that you back up the witnesses. But now your question is there other evidence?
Yes.
If you had, for example, even a mawdu' hadith, a very weak hadith, but its meaning is in harmony with the Qur'an or Sunnah or reason, and the meaning does not contradict something, you could say that that meaning is correct. And so the ulama will say, ma'nahu sahih. Its meaning is correct. So I could make up something right now. I could say, the sky is above and the earth is below. That's not a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, but the meaning is correct. But you can't, by evidence outside of hadith, you can't establish something as a hadith. So we're not trying to establish simply the meaning, but whether it was said by the Prophet. Because there's a big difference whether it was said by the Prophet or not. And so with reason, we can determine that Genghis Khan could have said something that was true and reasonable. And any person, the worst criminals you can think of, in some point in their lives must have said something that was true. And so there are people who actually fabricated hadiths because they just believe that any wisdom ought to be attributed to the Prophet. We ought to attribute any wisdom and any truth to the Prophet ﷺ. It all comes from him somehow. All wisdom and truth comes from Allah. Allah created the mind and He blessed us. And human beings have a fitrah. They've been created on a pure nature, searching for the truth, searching for Allah, and desiring to worship Him. And so human beings use their mind and creativity, and they say things that are true, people of any religion or no religion. But those aren't hadiths of the Prophet.
I had a question about some of the books we find da'if hadiths in, for example, Sirah or Tafsir, for example. Did those scholars know that they were da'if and they were using them to supplement it, or perhaps at that time it wasn't known?
Right. This question is about weak hadiths or da'if hadiths that are found commonly in the books of Sirah and Tafsir. Tafsir has two parts. There's Tafsir bil-Ma'thur and Tafsir bil-Ra'i. Ma'thur means with the hadith. As we said, Athar means with the hadith, yes, or with sayings of the Sahaba and the Imams. So it could have the Mawquf or Maqtu' in it. And because the ulama of Tafsir are looking for shades of meaning in the Qur'an. And so they don't only follow hadith of the Prophet, but sayings of Sahaba also, and the wisdom of the Imams, of the Tabi'een, are taken as evidence for some meaning. Not to contradict the Qur'an, but just to supply some wisdom or evidence of the meaning. And so Imam al-Tabari, the Sheikh of the Mufassirin, or Imam of the Mufassirin, who wrote a very important book of Tafsir, is the main source for those Tafsir. And he was trying to assemble anything that might shed some light. And he knew that some of them were not authentic, but he wanted to include as much as possible and preserve that. And so later scholars, some people were ignorant and they didn't look, they were ignorant of the fact that some of those things were weak and they just cited them. While other scholars were critical, like Ibn Kathir. He made a mukhtasar, or an abridged version of a Tabari, and he added his comments and his summaries. And so he would distinguish between what was authentic and what was not. And so Tabari's book was assembled for the benefit of having those all in one place, that we could examine all the sayings from the early generations of Islam about the tafsir. As far as the books of seerah, the problem is that to tell the whole story of the Prophet, you can't rely only on the Sahih. And so the narrations about history, the stories, are not on the same level of authenticity as what is about halal and haram, which is what the do's and don'ts of Islam, or about what we must believe as our aqeedah or our doctrines in Islam. Those are requirements for Muslims. We must know from authentic sources what to believe and practice. But the seerah are just stories about what happened. And so people's memories were defective. There were people also who fabricated many stories. And so there are books that have weak hadiths, but they don't contradict what's in the Qur'an and what is in authentic hadith. Those are okay as far as stories go. But then there are things that are contradictory, that are shadh, and mawdu'a, that are fabrications. Like, for example, the famous story of the Gharaniq, that Shaitan inserted into the recitation of the Prophet, that the idols worshipped Amounette and Uzza and, remind me of the ayah, Lat and Uzza and Amounette. Those three are, their shafa or their intercession is acceptable to Allah. And that is a fabrication. That is not a hadith of the Prophet, and it's been repeated in books. So it was in the book of Al-Waqidi, who is known for fabricating, and his book is full of fabrications. And so those are repeated today. And so you may have heard years ago about the controversy about the satanic verses. That's the story. And it is total fabrication. And so those things, when they're in contradiction to the Qur'an or the Sunnah, are not acceptable in Islam at all.
You know, some people, when you try to tell them about Sunnah or some hadith, they always say, what's your source? You know, what's your source? Even the most basic stuff when it deals to prayers and stuff. Are you supposed to do this?
Well, there are different cases. Of course, obviously, we shouldn't tell people things that we don't know from a source. And so, if you're telling somebody, you should say, well, it's from the Qur'an, or it's from the Sunnah. Or, for example, if you know the source, Bukhari or Muslim. If you don't know, you can look it up and tell them. I mean, people do have a right to ask some questions. However, when you're learning Islam, for example, and you're at a basic level, and you're learning from teachers, you need to ask them basically, are you teaching me from the Qur'an and the Hadith, or from your own opinion? Are you teaching me from authentic sources or not? And so if your teacher says, yes, I'm teaching you from authentic sources, the Qur'an and Sunnah, the agreement of the Imams of the Sunnah, then you're going to be confident, inshallah, that those people are going to be teaching you the truth. And as you advance in knowledge, you can learn more of the details. And that takes knowing the sources more. Which books of fiqh, which books of hadith, which ayah of the Qur'an. And so as you advance, you need to make more research. But to doubt everybody, and like every time I say something or you say something, we interrupt. Wait, what's your source for this? What's your source for that? Not everybody memorizes every hadith and every ayah. And, you know, you can be honest with people. You can say, listen, I learned from very good scholars, and I believe this is authentic information, and I will research it more and answer your questions, inshallah. If they're sincere questions, they will be very patient and learn. We should respect people of knowledge, especially those who teach us and guide us. But we are, in Islam, we are permitted to ask questions and to look at things critically and examine them, as long as we're sincere and respectful in doing that, inshallah. Jazakum Allahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah. He was a mercy unto the universe. Peace and blessings be on Al-Mustafa. So he began this perfect man, sending his word across the land, leading only by His Sunnah. In the Kur'an, the word of Allah, He brought the answer to this cruel world. Our beloved Prophet Muhammad.